Welcome back to the Zeitcast, friends, where we explore intersections of theology and culture, spirituality and culture. I'm telling y'all, this is a conversation that podcast-wise is so long overdue because I have been such a fan of my friend, the Reverend Brandan Robertson, for a long, long time. Brandan Robertson, one of the few preachers to have been reviewed in Rolling Stone. That's pretty great. Brandan, of course, the author of True Inclusion, Creating Communities of Radical Embrace, which, by the way, is one of my wife's favorite books. Nicole, it's
Amazing.
truly one of her favorite books. Was very formative for us in our table community, especially in OKC. The host of the Queer and Christian podcast, where he explores the intersection of faith and sexuality. Known as the TikTok pastor for his inclusive theological content, he reaches over 280,000 followers online. In addition to writing and podcasting, he speaks across the country on spirituality, justice, and LGBTQ inclusion. He currently serves as the pastor of Sunnyside Reformed Church in New York City. Brandan, you know I'm such a fan of your work. I'm such a fan of you as a human being. What a treat it is to have you on this Zeitcast. Thank you for being here, friend.
Well, likewise, Jonathan. I've been following you for so many years too. It's like been over a decade, and I'm so glad we're getting this chance to connect in this form.
That's hard to believe. So I literally, okay, thinking about this conversation earlier this morning, I really had, and we've had some beautiful times hanging out, but I had a flashback of the first time I met you preaching at the practice, right? Were you still in Chicago? Was that the first time we
Yeah,
met?
I was at Moody. Yeah, yeah,
I was going
yeah.
to say, were you still a student? I was thinking
Yep,
you were still a student.
totally.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. Has your life changed a little bit since you were a student at Moody?
In some ways it has, but like honestly, that practice community, like so much of that is who
Yeah.
I am today too. So that was such an
Yeah.
interesting moment. Yeah.
It was well, it was so cool even meeting you then because you were such a, I don't know, it was obvious just how, and I do use this phrase, anointed, such an anointed, gifted, so smart. You know, and one of the things I always say about you, Brandon, I love so much about what you do, and it's where it's fun. It's kind of like when they send Pete out into Fox News when you do certain like dialogues and stuff. Because like, you just know the scripture inside and out. It really is your mother tongue. It's your native language. And so I love the way you're always going deep into text, challenging people to go deeper into text, and unafraid to follow the text wherever they lead you. But such a great scholar around just scripture and theology, and yet doing all the kind of popular culture engagement that you do, and a local church pastor. I love it all, Brandon. It's
Well, thank you. And likewise, I think those are all the areas that truly, and I'm not just saying this, that you're so gifted in as well from your writing and your preaching. I mean, you're probably one of the best preachers in the country. Everyone says
uh,
that. And so it's so good to get to learn from you over these past 10 years and
mm,
yeah, to be in this space with you.
I don't know that everyone says that, but it means the world coming from you. That's deeply humbling and kind. Well, and pastoring is really a place I'd kind of like to start because um, while you do all the other things, you are very much grounded in a community doing real work pastorally. And so I'd love to ask you first, as we're getting into Advent, and I know I put out a little Advent book, it kind of in a whirlwind last year, 8 days into Advent. It
Yeah,
felt
there
like
you
kind
go.
of an emergency Advent book, but trying to take my time and ease into it this year. I'm wondering off the top, like, what Advent means to you in 2024 in the midst of all the things, just where your head and heart are drawn
Yeah.
stepping into this season of waiting.
It's divine timing, as it were, that like 20 minutes ago I finished my sermon for Sunday and we used the
Mm,
lectionary. And funny enough, the lectionary is already kind of getting into Advent. So I'm preaching on this passage in Daniel of kind of the ancient Jewish hope of this one like the Son of Man coming in the clouds to set the world right. And the message that I ended up coming to was our hope as Christians, and one of the reasons I still remain a Christian, despite deconstructing so many beliefs, is that there is this persistent hope and an acknowledgement that God alone can set the world right.
yeah.
And humans, we have a lot to do with it. We can do a lot of really good work. I think God works in and through us, but overcoming that hurdle of sin, our brokenness, our
Mm,
flawed desires, just doesn't seem in the human capacity to do. And that's where Christianity does have a very unique and powerful message that God will
mm,
one day step in and fix the mess that we're in. And so while we should be at work in this moment, we've got a lot to resist and a lot to
yeah.
protest and a lot to build over the next 4 years. I also want to root myself and my community in there's a hope that at the end of all we can do,
Yeah.
with 2,000 years of Christians behind us, we join in this hope that God is going to come and redeem and restore the world. I don't know what that looks like. I don't
Yeah.
tend to believe that's going to be Jesus on a horse coming in the clouds anymore, but I do believe God has to step in and will step in. And that's what Advent was about for the Jewish folks that were longing for the Messiah, and it's what it
Yeah.
is for us today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I love thinking about all the ways that God has come, that God is coming, that God is yet to come. And as you say, I guess I really am leaning in right now to that sense of there's so much that needs to be made right. Maybe more than a drive-by, Brent, I'd love to ask you, because you use that three-letter word sin
Yeah.
there. I know probably both of us think about sin a lot differently than we used to, but it's certainly a word that's still important to me. I think about Barbara Brown Taylor had that great book title years ago of Speaking of Sin. I think it is a word that I still find useful, though I know for a lot of folks it comes with a lot of baggage. So when you talk about sin and our need to be delivered from it, our need to be saved from our sins, what does that word mean for you now when we think about those barriers to this really embracing Advent hope?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about sin, one, I think it's like an evolutionary reality. Humans are
Mm,
evolutionarily conditioned to be selfish. We are. We are to preserve our own lives and preserve the lives of our tribe. And there's usefulness in that. But
yeah.
clearly, when that selfishness extends to, for instance, voting for candidates and supporting policies that only benefit me and my community at the expense of others, um, that's what I think is the definition of sin. It's when
Mm,
greed and self-interest begins to harm others. And I think if I was theologically defining it, I would say anything that pulls me away from love of God, love of neighbor, or love of self. And
mm,
so I'm with you. I try not to actually use the language of sin in many contexts, but I also think there is some usefulness for those of us who have done the healing work, and I think there needs to be a
yeah.
lot of healing for so many people, to reclaim the language that's so often used against us or used in really bad and toxic ways. And so that's why I use the word sin in this context and think
Yeah.
it's helpful. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Francis Spufford had that definition years ago, the human propensity to F things up.
Yeah.
And I do, and I guess partly too, being around communities where folks are in recovery, I
Mm.
do think there's something so important about, in a way that's not wallowing, but just being able to name your own stuff.
Yeah.
That's liberating, that's
Yeah.
not supposed to, that actually brings liberation and freedom and healing.
Totally.
Um, but maybe leaning a little bit more to just kind of like in the Advent thing, when you talk about we don't know what it looks like for God to come kind of in that ultimate sense. But in this own like season of waiting within your community, what does it look like to try to carve out space for God and for this kind of waiting, just in terms of your own practices you're leading your community in right now? What
Yeah.
does the waiting look like?
I mean, it is necessary to cultivate that space. I remember 2 weeks ago, right after the election, when I got up to preach, and this will say a lot about my community, but there were a lot of
Mm,
people in the pews literally weeping, just not
mm,
able to hold the anxiety and the grief of what's happening in our country at this moment. And I think this is where spirituality in general, but Christianity in particular, has some really unique gifts.
yeah,
This is a religion for people who are suffering. This is a religion that emerged from people who are suffering. Our central image is a man on a cross who is suffering. And
mm,
so, just this constant reminder, in whatever way it works, like my spirituality doesn't look very traditionally Christian anymore. I don't spend hours praying like I used to when I was an evangelical, but inviting folks to open space to perceive God, to perceive
mm,
beauty, to perceive goodness in the world as a reminder that, as crazy as it all seems right now, good
yeah,
is still happening. And the way that we're actually going to move forward in the next 4 or however many years is focusing locally in our own
yeah,
communities, in our own families. How can we overturn injustice through one subversive act of love at a time? If we can do that, and we all can do that, we're going to feel a lot more hopeful. And if everybody starts doing
yeah.
that, goodness, we can topple the unjust systems of this world and help see the kingdom of God established.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting how that becomes then Advent a more active kind of waiting when we think that way, when there really isn't just this sense of like just kind of waiting Jesus to come on the horse, but also this sense of like, okay, well, I think about the language of Paul's in Romans a lot, that in a very real way, the world is waiting for the manifestation of the children of God, that the world
Yeah,
is kind of waiting
yeah,
for God's people to do their thing. So it's like there's this strange way that we're both waiting for God, but also remembering that the world is waiting on the church to do the things that we're called to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. And that's the hard balance theologically. I'm not exactly sure what to do with it right now because I agree. And I would actually preach and have preached in the past that I kind of perhaps believe that the second coming of Christ was Pentecost. It's when
Mm,
Christ comes back, fills the church up, and
yeah,
Paul begins calling us the body of Christ. And I don't think that's a metaphor. And so, in some sense, I don't think Jesus has ever left. I think Jesus is
yeah,
here in and through all of us. And there's got to be something more. Like there
yeah,
has to be. And I do feel like there have been periods in my life where I've kind of cut off my belief in a second coming or God
mm,
ultimately doing something. And frankly, it just led me into psychological despair. And
yeah,
so I don't know if it's objectively true, and I don't actually care if it's objectively true. I think it's
yeah.
hopeful for us to believe that something has to happen and will happen to redeem and restore the world.
Mm. I love your honesty in saying that, Brendan, because like as a person who's I've never found any apologetics convincing. No
Yeah.
apologetic has ever helped me much. I think rational reasons too. I find it to be very freeing to be able to say sometimes, yeah, there's some things I believe because I need to believe them, and yeah,
Yeah.
like the fact that I don't want to like just sit in a stew of nihilism is actually yes,
Yeah.
but there is that sense that of a longing for something transcendent, but that happens in the world that only God can do. I don't know how to live without that hope. And I also
Yeah.
feel like I've tried to sort of unfasten myself from it at times and found like, no, I think at minimum, I need that kind of hope for whatever that form takes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm feeling you there.
Yeah, I mean, so many atheists, and I love some of my best friends now are atheists, and I think there's so many beautiful things to learn from them as Christians. And the popular argument against religion is often it's just a psychological crutch. And I've come
Sure.
to the place being like, yeah, that's exactly what religion at its best is. It's
Yeah.
helping us cope with the pain and brokenness of our world. Like,
Hmm.
amen to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
There could be worse things like it not being a crutch, but actually damaging
yeah,
people and breaking people, which I
yeah,
think in its
yeah,
worst
yeah.
case.
Religion at its best is a crutch. At its worst, it's that millstone around our necks that's hanging us down. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Even thinking about like toxic religion, Brandon, part of what I love about your work pastorally, and I'd love for you to maybe kind of hit this both directions. Because on the one hand, when you talk about the Sunday after the election, people coming in and they're grieving, and I still feel like I'm in proximity with folks where I do feel like I have to explain sometimes. Yeah, like for a lot of our friends, this isn't just a sense of like, oh, our person lost
Yeah.
and we're crying in our beer, but no, like a sense where people's core identities are called into question, and but so like tending to that grief, but at the same time, I see you out there regularly engaging folks in the really difficult conversations with folks that you kind of know going in, you probably aren't going to change their minds. I love that you do it. Um, I'm curious, the further you go, like how useful do you find that to be? Like, and even kind of living within those two worlds where you're both pastoring a community where I'm sure you're more drawing, as any of us would. We draw folks who tend to be more like us
Yeah.
theologically and otherwise, but then also intentionally putting yourself in really vulnerable spaces
Yeah.
with folks with ideologies and theologies that I think we would both name as toxic.
Yeah. I've thought about this a lot over the years because it's not always fun or even helpful to my own mental health in some of the conversations I have sometimes. And I do find myself wondering, is this worth it? What I've come to is two things. One, when I engage publicly in those conversations, it's not for the interviewer. I don't care. I
Yeah.
know I'm not going to convince whoever I'm talking to, and they're not going to convince me. But the thing that drew me to progressive Christianity was when I was doing my podcast in college and I was talking to people like our dear friend Brian McLaren and other folks
Mm.
who just embodied a Christ likeness.
Yeah.
So even though I disagreed with his theology when I talked to him on my podcast at Moody Bible Institute,
Mm.
I remember walking away and talking to my friends and being like, that man was more like Christ than people on our side. And
Mm.
without sounding completely arrogant, I do hope that when I enter into those conservative spaces, I can embody the fruit of the Spirit and be Christ-like, even if
Yeah.
they're not, because that's what changes people's hearts and minds.
Yeah.
And the other side of it is, I do think for those of us who have done the healing, and I have a decade now of therapy and medication and lots of work
Mm.
done to heal from a lot of my religious trauma, I do think it's imperative for us in our personal lives to not cut off the conservative, to not
Yeah.
cut off the Trump supporter, because again, you can't change hearts and minds by debate. You change
Yeah.
hearts and minds through relationship. And like my best friend in the world, I talk about him quite often, is a Republican, a
Mm,
65-year-old Republican man in DC who I love more than anyone. And we have some of the best and most challenging conversations, and both of us have been reshaped in so many ways because of these conversations. And
mm.
so just seeing that be so generative for me, I really do hope in these next 4 years we don't retreat to our silos, but we open up our tables and say,
Yeah.
let's have a conversation because that's how we're going to change people's hearts.
Yeah. And it's the both and there of both, as you say, like having these conversations where out of the gate, you kind of know, okay, I'm definitely not going to change the interviewer's mind or the person I'm debating or something. And yet this sense that I have to believe that hearts and minds are still being changed out there somewhere. And Brandon, I can't affirm this in you enough. That's one of the things I love most about seeing those spaces is as capable as you are theologically and as rooted and grounded as you are in scripture, being able to unpack the text, there is such a Christ-like, there's a fierce but tender, there's a gentle presence that I do think seeing that witness, and then people have the opportunity to see the contrast. Okay, so not just in theologies,
Yeah.
but in what's in here. And
Yeah.
I've thought that in a number of the conversations I've heard with you. It's like, gosh, surely somebody is noticing the difference in kind of the soul language here between
Yeah.
this person who is still intentionally choosing to be humble and to be kind and to engage in ways that just, I gotta go. This is a great like bio question for me. When you talk about having Brian McLaren on your podcast when you were at Moody, and it sounds like still being a little scandalized. And
Yeah.
again, as a person who's so steeped within the text and in Christian tradition, so what was the turning point for you as a student at Moody in terms of the genesis of the person that you are now? Where did that start?
You know, I'm so grateful for how God has worked in my life because when I got saved in a fundamentalist church, but I ended up in this evangelical mega church as a high schooler. And the church is called Bridgeway Community Church. The pastor there is Dr. David Anderson. He's still one of my mentors and dear friends.
Mm,
And Bridgeway, his whole idea of that church was build bridges across divides. And so I grew up in a mega church that was evangelical and conservative, but Brian McLaren endorsed David Anderson's book Gracism that he wrote about racism, and he would
mm,
have conversations with progressive Christians and Catholics, people we believed were not actually Christians in our theology, but had generative, loving conversations with people. And because that was such a formative period of my life, I think it set me up to become who I am today,
mm,
which was when I got to Moody, we would have the professors, like literally we had N.T. Wright come and speak in Chicago, and the next day our professors did a seminary called The Right Response, contrasting and saying why N.T. Wright was a heretic. And like that was
wow.
the environment we lived in. And I was just like, this is not what I learned that Christianity is supposed to look like.
Mm,
And so the podcast was called The Bridge, copying my pastor. And our whole point was let's talk to these people that are gaining popularity. At the time, Brian had just married his gay son, and it was all over Christianity
mm.
Today. And it was like, okay, let's hear what he has to say. And yeah, so I'm just grateful that my early formation of faith was about bridge building, which is
Yeah.
not the case for so many evangelicals.
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting to see then how much that informs your work now in terms
Yeah,
of like building bridges is clearly so critical.
totally, totally. And
Mm.
yeah, all I can say is thanks be to God that, I mean, I think my life would look very differently if I was in some of these other churches that so many of us
Yeah.
did grow up in that were so toxic. I had a less toxic version of evangelicalism, so that was good.
Mm. So I'm assuming Brian would be on this list, but I'm curious of like who were some of the voices, mentors, some of the figures that first started to crack you open to even imagine that there was a Christianity that was different than kind of the system that you were in at Moody.
Yeah. I mean, the moment that everything changed, people can still watch it on video today. Because I was doing this podcast at Moody. Richard Rohr was in town doing a conference, and somehow we ended up getting time with Richard Rohr one on one. We recorded this beautiful conversation. And during the conversation, I literally started to tear up because we went in with our loaded questions. We
Mm.
literally in the interview were like, you're a universalist. How do you
Mm.
justify this? And he is so gracious and laughed and was like, you evangelicals jump to say universalism, but hear it, and just beautifully, gently explained how he understood God and Christ and the way salvation works in the world.
Mm.
And that conversation alone, like in real time on this, I've watched the interview hundreds of times because
Hmm.
I really saw my heart open up. And I was like,
Wow.
I don't have all the theological answers at the moment, but what he said is true, and I can feel the truthfulness of it. And that
Yeah.
is the same kind of thing that when I got saved, it
Yeah.
wasn't mental. It was, I felt the truthfulness of Jesus Christ. And so Richard Rohr is up there for me.
Yeah.
And then that just opened Pandora's box. I was hanging out with Aaron
Mm.
Nyquist and
Yeah.
all that world, and just continued to find good people all around.
The first time I heard Father Rohr in person, it really struck me because I think I knew this, but I hadn't thought much about it. The fact that his earliest formation was in the Pentecostal church before converting to Catholicism.
Yeah.
And what so struck me the first time I heard him in person is how much he really does operate in that kind of charismatic gift and presence,
Mm.
where it is more like, oh, no, here's a person profoundly full of the Spirit who's surfing, in the
Yeah.
room and is vibing and kind of like, but I was so struck by just what a rich, charismatic gift that is in a way that does feel like, okay, there is just such a powerful witness of the Spirit in him and a tenderness that does kind of break you open. I just love it that you came in kind of almost kind of ready to Jesus you, Richard
Yeah,
Rohr.
yeah. And I mean, honestly, if you want to learn how to bridge build, watch Richard Rohr. He doesn't
Yeah,
mince words. He will say, I
yeah,
mean, he has that great quote that the evangelical support of Trump will be an indictment against the validity of their movement for ages to come. Like, he says the truth,
yeah.
but he does it in a way that people can hear it, and it's really
Mm,
profound.
mm. It's one of the things that I would connect with from Father Rohr to you is I feel like that same sort of hopefulness, that it's
Mm.
kind of while you have the really difficult conversations, it never feels like anything degenerates into. I mean, you're clearly not a cynic, and I mean, you talked earlier about kind of choosing to still believe in that way. I'm wondering, like, how in the midst of times like these, and I know that, I mean, because again, a lot of this has been on public stages in terms of your encounters with much less beautiful versions and visions of Christianity. How through all of that have you kind of had the soul resources to sustain that hopefulness? Because I just always feel like with you, it's like the tenderness is always so present, and I admire the way that you've found a way to cling to that, even in very untender kind of situations.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is I haven't. And
Mm,
I hid it well from public, whatever that means. But like, there was a period at the beginning of the pandemic where I left pastoral ministry,
yeah.
moved to Washington, D.C., and spent a few years just like, I'm ready to throw in the towel on all of this. It's not worth
Mm,
it. It's broken. Progressive Christianity is broken.
yeah.
Conservative Christianity is broken. It's all broken. Um, and again, it was in those periods where I leaned into relationships that mattered to me, people that like were in my geographical location that I could sit with and be broken with.
Yeah.
And I mentioned my friend who's a Republican, also a wonderful progressive theologian.
Mm,
Interesting tension, but like in that period, I had essentially a mental breakdown. I had to go stay at his house for
mm,
a week, and he just cared for me and talked to me about theology, about God, about spirituality. And it was seeing Christ likeness in him and in others
mm.
around me that was like, this has something that I think can still help the world. And the reason I'm still part of the church is while I do believe Jesus saved me when I was 12, I
Yeah.
also have come to think that what also saved 12-year-old Brandon was even in this fundamentalist community, the
Mm,
church was a community for outcasts and weirdos like me. And I
yeah.
went in and they loved me and gave me a place to belong and to build community. And so, even on my most cynical days, I think, man, the church has a really important social role for people.
Yeah.
And yes, I believe there is a spiritual nourishment that comes through that. But like, I'm still in this because I think it works. I've seen it work in my own life. And
Mm,
even in my most cynical moments, I'm drawn back to it.
mm. I love that, Brandon. I know on the heels of asking about hopefulness, I don't mean to drop backwards, but maybe in terms of cynicism, I'm curious because I know that in my earliest experiences of having community with people who were more inclusive, it was such a revolution for me that there definitely was a bit of a naive, like, oh, well, now that I'm around other people who also believe in a God that is larger and more expensive, and there's room for all kinds of people and stories. I'm sure I carried a bit of an idyllic expectation into that. I'm very mindful of what Bonhoeffer says in Life Together about, when you come into a community and you impose your idealistic expectations. But I have been in and around more progressive Christian communities now, to know the not so secret truth that progressive Christian communities can be just as maddening as any other kind of Christian community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And go ahead, please.
Yeah, it's just, well, I think community itself is maddening, right?
Yes,
Like,
yes.
people are full of issues and brokenness and opinions and blah, blah, blah. And so, like, even my lovely church community, we still have the same issues I had in conservative church communities.
Yeah.
It's just like perspectives and people and all of that. I also think, I mean, I don't want to go too far down this path unless you want to, but it's like I've been thinking a lot about this election, and I think it gives us a
Sure.
moment to think about what's happening in progressive Christianity. I think sometimes we can get into an elitist mindset. I
Yeah.
think we can think, people often say we become fundamentalists on the other side. Like, we've
Yeah.
got it figured out. Everybody else is ignorant and dumb and bigoted. That doesn't work, friends. Like, that's just not a good way to spiritually orient ourselves. And it's not a message that wins people to our version of the Christian faith. And so I just think, like, if progressive Christianity has one major issue that I would critique, it's the same one that conservative Christians have. Stop being so confident that you're right about everything.
Yeah.
Be willing to be challenged and be wrong, and to have different perspectives inform your faith. And that's as much of a word for me, like, because I do get on the internet every single day and give my
Sure.
opinions as if they're absolute fact, and they're not. None of us have this
Yeah.
figured out, and so let's
Yeah.
be more honest about that.
I so appreciate you naming that, and I'd be happy to go as far in that conversation as you want in terms of just some of the dynamics stuff like the election exposes, and thinking about, it's an interesting word about elitism, because I think for people like us, it's like we know fundamentalism when we see it, and I think that was one of the unpleasant surprises. And I do think, again, we're in a moment now where all that is having to be like renegotiated, but it's interesting just even the sort of like the linguistic, kind of absolute ideological purity still can feel like you didn't say the right prayer, you didn't say the magic prayer, you didn't repeat the words after me. But that sense, especially when people are clearly well-intentioned and doing the best they could, because there was a moment in particular where it started to feel like, okay, there really is not room, even for people who are on an authentic journey. Almost like you could see somebody start to move or transition. It's like almost like shooting them when they're halfway across the street for not already being on the other side of the street.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, when I use the language of elitism for Democrats or progressive Christians, obviously, one of the beautiful things about our side of the aisle, so to speak, is that we do represent so many beautiful marginalized communities. And what I think is the problem, and I think everybody is saying this now post-election, is it's not the people that are the problem. It's not the people that make up the Democratic base or the people that make up the Republican base. It's the institutions that set orthodoxies and that set standards for how things have to be, and there's no other option, and you have to submit. That is toxic religion. That is toxic politics. And I don't think progressive Christianity, like, we don't have the same sort of governing bodies as conservative Christian institutions do. But there is less and less, but often, an orthodoxy. And it's like, if you don't believe all the right things about social issues, you can't belong. And the problem is, our communities need to be the places where people can come when they don't believe what we believe and are educated and transformed and can move along. And I just think too many of us are too dogmatic and too quick to demonize on all sides. And again, I'm speaking to myself here, because it's hard when I sit down in my church office, as I did the past year, with somebody who said, I don't believe it's okay that you're a gay pastor.
Wow.
And it's like, this is somebody in my community, and my answer to this person cannot be, you're a bigot, you don't know what you're talking about. It has to be, tell me about why you feel this way. Let's wrestle with the text together. And that was hard, triggering, frustrating. But it's the only way that there was any transformation that could have happened.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. My dear friend Elisa here just had a comparable situation where she's literally preaching at a local Methodist church, and someone corners her in the study afterwards with kind of like, what about Romans 1? And it kind of became like a whole thing. What a fascinating situation for somebody to be on any level connected to the community and coming to the church and still having a conversation with you that says,
Yeah.
I don't think it's okay that you're a gay pastor. It also says a ton about the kind of pastor that you are, that the person felt comfortable having that kind of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think this was necessarily unique to me. I think though, like this is what the church is. The
Yeah.
spiritual gymnasium. It should be the place where I mean, I've noticed this. I'm getting my PhD in biblical studies, and it's become so clear to me that
Mm.
there's such a separation between this like academic progressive Christianity that I now get to operate in over here,
Yeah.
and that knowledge never comes to the pews for most people. And it's like
Yeah.
part of my passion these days is like, how do we take all this beautiful knowledge about our faith
Mm.
and move it to help actually educate people in the pews whose lives can be made better by thinking about God in new ways or thinking about the Bible in new ways. And so I think that's all of our work, to educate the
Hmm.
people with what we know and to help be educated by the people that show up in our pews and help them or allow them to transform us
Yeah.
as spiritual leaders.
Yeah. It's really one of the things, Brandon, I love most about just who you are and what you do is like the both the, which, it's the same way I always say, like Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, where there's banners everywhere that say unapologetically black and unashamedly Christian, that I feel more of a radical welcome there than in any space I've ever been in, but with this deep sense of identity of like
Yeah.
who they are within the tradition. I see that so much with you in the way that I feel like you always own your identity as as a gay pastor and all that, but also in this way that's so integrated, and it's like, yes, it's precisely because I know who I am and I'm establishing my identity this way that I am also a much broader person. I'd love you to speak to that a bit, the way, because I feel like you model that so beautifully, like kind of grounded in the particularity of your own identity, but in a way that I see you always expanding more, not less, rather than that becoming like a rigid, like being confined by that definition in some way.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, it's one of the biggest challenges because, to be very honest, like I was kind of done with the queer Christian conversation, and it was
Mm,
only I have this book coming out, and it was because the editor reached out to me and said, "I want you to write the book that you want to write, but before you do that, you have to write another book about being queer and Christian." And I was
mm,
like, I don't want to, like, I'm done with that because theologically, there's only so much you can say on the topic before you're
sure.
repeating yourself. But through the process of writing this book and being forced to kind of go back in and see if I could mine new things about queerness and Christianity, I think I discovered exactly how you articulated it. That the one thing I think progressives do really well is encourage us to own the unique incarnations of our
Mm,
experience in the world.
yeah.
Because it's not by minimizing, it's not by saying, I don't see color, I don't see sexuality, I don't see gender. Of course you do. We all
Yeah.
do. And part of what makes the church, I think, such a beautiful and unique place is that we can invite people to come in, own all of who they are, but not stop there. I'm
Yeah.
not just queer Brandon. I am queer,
Yeah.
progressive, Christian, blah, 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 all the other things that make me Brandon. And I do seek to try to embody that and not like in the church environment. I'm not speaking about being gay every week,
Sure.
barely speaking about that because that's not the end of my identity, but
Mm-hmm.
it is important that we own who we are. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there's magic that happens when we can look out at the crowd in our community and see the diversity and know the owned diversity and then listen and learn and be transformed by it. There's
Yeah.
magic there.
Yeah. I remember actually it was years before you served there, but being at like a retreat with Mission Gathering in San Diego. And
Yeah.
you, of course, remember some of the great kind of elders in that church that have been
Yeah.
around for like a long time. And that was interesting because I was still more new to some of those kinds of inclusive space in a wonderful way. But hearing people say, like, yeah, we don't want to go to a church that waves flags every Sunday. We don't want to hear about this all the time. And
Yeah.
hearing that often, this kind of sense of like not wanting to be constricted in that way. Um, because I've kind of gone on my way to not ask you to play the greatest hits because I'm sure you get tired of them. I thought about you in particular with the whole, Richard Hayes putting out the book with his son, and I and others who, of course, been affected by Richard Hayes' work. I remember, when I read Moral Vision of the New Testament at the time, it was just, it was a monumental work. But I'm assuming that for Hayes, as I recall, I think probably his last holdout exegetically was a reading of kind of Romans 1 before, but now kind of him coming full circle. I'm curious, especially like because I feel like that's still the text I have the most conversations about. Is Is that the one you hear mostly? Is it Leviticus? Like when people come to you, like the guy in your office, like
Yeah.
what is the main text? Or either from scripture or life that they bring as a challenge?
Yeah. I mean, I think Leviticus is having a resurgence,
Mm,
interestingly. I've been hearing more and more about it, but I do think for Christians, Romans 1 is it. And the biggest shift, and I start this new book this way because this is where I actually do stand. The problem isn't these verses, the problem is how we view the Bible to begin with.
mm,
So, what completely undermines Romans 1 from the beginning is let's concede that Paul is condemning all same sex relationships for men
mm,
and women in Romans 1. Paul is wrong.
mm.
Like, there's now a freedom that I have through my academic engagement with the Bible to recognize, like, I don't use the words inerrant anymore or infallible. That's not what this text is. It's a library, a diary of our forerunners in the faith, and it very much reflects their culture, their worldviews. And Paul lived in a world that did view people who, particularly to get graphic, if you were sexually penetrated by another person in the Roman world, you were considered less than a woman, which is saying a lot in that world, meaning
Yeah,
you are not even barely human.
yeah,
So that's the worldview Paul grew up with. Of course, if he were to look at a same sex couple in his world, that's how he's going to interpret it, and that's the conclusion he's going to come to. Now, I don't think that's actually not, I don't think, the best academic interpretation of what Paul was doing.
yeah.
But I do say that just to say we need to rethink what the Bible is and how we
Mm,
engage it and what authority we give to it.
mm,
But the quick answer is simply in the Greco-Roman world, yes, there were a few notable same-sex couples and relationships. But by and large, Roman law said men were permitted to have sex with anyone they wanted, literally anyone, so long as they were of a lower social status. Anyone conservative or liberal today would say that is a really horrible way to govern sexual ethics, that
yeah.
men have ultimate authority to do whatever they want to whomever they want without consequence. If that was the sexual world you were looking at and you were seeing Roman men going around and forcibly having sex with their slaves,
Mm,
you would condemn that too. I would condemn that too. And I think that is certainly the world that Paul was living in. That is what he was seeing taking place primarily.
yeah.
And that's the mindset he has as he's writing Romans 1. And I agree. And the last thing I'll say is like, it's such an unfortunate reality that the rest of Paul's writings, when he talks about arsenokoitai in First Corinthians and First Timothy, that should be translated as something like men who sexually abuse other men. And
Right.
it's so sad that we haven't had that translation because we've now
Mm,
seen and are seeing how big sexual abuse is within the church.
yes.
Imagine if that was so clearly articulated in scripture as it
Yeah.
actually is. Like, but we've gone on this red herring to condemn the gays and make it all about
Mm-hmm.
something that's not harmful to anyone. And it's
Mm-hmm.
unfortunate. Yeah.
And it's the incredibly glaring, like, for so much attention and focus to go there, and yet we continue to see, including and perhaps especially in the most conservative spaces, just how much it's like, oh well, if these texts are so clear, how do we miss that abuse is but it's like it is strange the kind of projection that creates and the capacity, to kind of give us a scapegoat where everybody, um, you kind of, preface that by saying, even if you're kind of reading Romans 1 on those terms, is the way you read it ultimately in context? Is it something more like what like Doug Campbell does? That kind of like, especially in the broader argument of then where he goes with Romans 2, that's not really what it's about. Like, what's kind of your sense of what is your kind of better reading of Romans 1 and 2 in that way?
Yeah, I would just say Paul is clearly talking to a church of people gathered in an empire, primarily Jewish people that are making up these Christian communities in an empire, in a culture that was fundamentally opposed to everything first century Judaism was about. This was
Mm,
an idolatrous people. This was a people that were literally oppressing the Jewish people. And so Paul's trying to explain in Romans 1 how the Roman culture has become so degenerate and wicked and evil. And as you know, in Romans 2, then he flips it on its head and says,
yeah.
but we're not much better. Um, and what I also think, even though the scholarship is a little bit dicey around things like temple prostitution and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
Paul clearly connects the same sex behavior to idolatry. He begins with, you exchanged the truth for a lie, worshipped created things instead of creator God.
Yeah.
Therefore, God gave them over to the lust of their flesh, men exchanged natural relations, etc. So in his mind, whatever's happening in Rome is a result of their idolatry and the not right relationship they have to the one true God.
Yeah.
That alone, which is so clear in the reading of Romans 1, removes that as a verse that can be used against anyone who's a
Right.
gay Christian, because idolatry is the prerequisite for the behavior in the text.
Yeah.
And I worship the same God Paul worships. So
Yeah.
he would have to have a whole nother chapter if he wanted to condemn folks like me in the world, because that's not who he was thinking about very clearly in the text. And I do also think, as you said, Romans 2 flips that whole argument on the head, and the church misses that so often. He says, yes, Rome is terrible. Y'all have all of your issues too, so let us not judge anyone, for where God's grace abounds, or for where sin abounds, God's grace abounds all the more. And that's the broader message of the gospel that Paul articulates.
It's so beautiful. And I love the way, because I guess I'm thinking again about you in the oh my gosh, I just can't imagine being in the office, having this conversation with a parishioner, and it just makes me think again. It's like because I love the way you talk about the text, but the sense as well of like, um, at the end of the day, I mean, I think I'm so fundamentally Pentecostal to my core. I just am. That orientation around the Spirit shaped everything for me,
Yeah.
and ultimately, the witness of the Spirit in my gay friends was so overpowering. It was like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, I have to rethink the text because I can't deny the witness of the Spirit in this way. And I just love how, because I don't know how that conversation ended or where that goes from here, but just the witness of, again, even being willing to engage with tenderness, that kind of dialogue, just what a powerful witness that is. What does happen at the end of a conversation like that? Like, where do you go from there? Like, what is
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to be as honest as I can about this, but I mean, the end of that conversation was that person actually ended up leaving the church. Now,
uh,
I spent 2 years, probably 20 plus hours in conversation with this person,
wow.
and uh, it's hard when that happens. And it was worth it. Every step of the way was worth it,
Yeah.
because I did form a deep friendship with that person, and they are still connected to the community as friends. And I think we have to get used to that in this new world that we're living in as well. That sometimes we're going to give, I think, I gave the best possible scholarship. I gave this person all the books and
Mm,
all the scholarships, and we still didn't agree.
sure.
And this person is a great person. This
Mm,
person really has a theology that makes them be very careful about how to reinterpret the Bible, because they're afraid of the judgment of God.
yeah.
And I remember what that feels like.
Sure.
And so rather than just saying, well, you're a bigot,
Yeah.
you need to leave, it's, yeah, I get that this is really hard for you. And I get that you believe hell is on the other end
Mm,
of answering this
right.
question wrong. And that's why I say, like, the gay conversation, for me, it's not interesting to spend time debating the 6 clobber passages.
Sure.
It's interesting to help people reformulate how they see God, and I would argue in a more Christ-like way, because it begins there. If
Yeah.
God is a divine judge who's going to condemn you because you believe the wrong thing,
Yeah.
no matter what I say, you're not going to change your mind.
Mm,
But if you believe that salvation is by God's grace alone, because God is love, and all of us are going to be redeemed in the end, as I think the scripture teaches, that frees you to be like, wow,
yeah.
the pressure's off me to get everything right. And
Yeah.
that's a good space to be in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, and that I know that was so in my own journey too. That sense of when you grasp the character of God differently, which probably was the thing that came first, was the sense of like, okay, the God that I know really isn't like a lot of the fire and brimstone that I've heard, and the more I came to believe that the character of God was different, along within the witness of vulnerable people in my life. Brent, and maybe this would be a good question to land on because you've done this at a couple turns now, talking about people who, for all kinds of reasons, may believe things, may say things that are in a way are kind of dehumanizing,
Mm.
delegitimizing, and yet you talk repeatedly about not demonizing people who might in fact demonize you. And I know I'm quite certain you'd have plenty of progressive folks in your life, as I do in mine, who kind of say the opposite of that, of like, well, people demonize you because they are in fact bad people, and don't engage them, shame them, cut the cords and stuff. Like, how is it possible to interact regularly with theology and ideology that may negate, that may demonize or dehumanize, and yet not dehumanize those folks
Mm.
in return? What has given you just the capacity to be able to continue to do that?
Yeah. I mean, So here's the truth. There are bad people in the world.
Mm.
Most people are not bad people.
Yeah.
And so I think what we have in this moment, and I think media is doing this, social media is doing it, the worst voices and people with the worst ethics and perhaps get elevated to the leader of the country. And
Mm.
then we say, everyone who is in that camp is that.
Yeah.
That's just not true. And the way that I know that that's not true is that I've had the privilege of sitting down with people who very much see the world differently, who I do think make immoral choices or have immoral beliefs. But when you really begin to get in relationship and uncover what's going on there, you see that it's fear, it's lack of
Yeah.
information, it's lack of experience. I still remember when Trump won the first time, Oprah and Van Jones both, immediately following that election, sat down with Trump voters on TV and did that. They were like, tell
Hmm.
us what your thinking is here. And it was a beautiful and profound conversation that really helped me be like, oh, wow, these are not all fundamentally unchangeable, terrible people. These are people
Yeah.
that are just uninformed, have bad life experiences, whatever. So I want to be careful and say, yes, I don't think everybody should be in conversation with everyone, especially
Sure.
if you like have a family member that is staunchly opposed to you, like you're probably not going to change a family member's mind. So protect yourself. Don't try
Yeah.
to win a debate there. But our response should not be in our day-to-day lives. Somebody has a different perspective and I'm cutting them out. And
Mm.
the verse that keeps coming up is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's really
Mm.
hard to live out Jesus's commands. I don't do it very well. But when I do, it tends to work.
Yeah.
And if we can learn to love the conservative, love the non-affirming Christian, love the evangelical as we love ourselves and our communities, we might be able to actually win some of them over. And so, at
Mm.
that sense, it's just good strategy. If we're trying to
Yeah.
transform the world,
Yeah.
this is how you do it. And so, that's at least what I'm thinking when I'm trying to engage in these conversations, knowing also that the person on the other side probably has this as their agenda as well. We're both
Sure.
trying to change each other. And
Yeah.
that's actually kind of a fun space to be in, to be honest. So,
It's like the Spider-Man meme. It's like
yes, yes.
like we're both trying to evangelize each other. I do. It is weird because I actually do feel like I operate with a kind of intentionality in that way now that I never did the first half of my life. It's like, oh, now I'm really intentional as an
Yeah.
evangelist. It's like I'm very like, it just makes me laugh sometimes how much I almost find myself constantly thinking, yes, I think I can worm myself into this space and
Yeah.
hopefully break somebody open to a really human, authentic conversation somewhere.
We need
Uh,
more progressive Christian evangelists. So let's
yeah,
get out there.
yeah, I believe it.
Yeah.
Maybe to just to bring this back full circle, Brandon, going into Advent, I'd love it if there is whatever direction you want to go over this, whether it's if it's a verse, if it's a thought, if it's a blessing, if it's a prayer, but maybe as people are entering in Advent with all of the cultural things that are swirling, and I know for a lot of folks, we'll be going into holiday meals starting this week, where things might be complicated. Just what encouragement would you want to leave folks with who are going into this Advent probably with all kinds of trepidation for all
Mm.
kinds of reasons, both what's happening in the world around them, but also the things that are stirred up in the world within us in a moment like
Yeah.
this?
Yeah. I mean, I say every single year that I'm never more of a Orthodox Christian than during Advent and Christmas. I
Mm,
believe this story.
yeah.
And I think, I forget what the exact verse is, but it's probably Isaiah, the prophecy that says, behold, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light.
Mm,
That's what we're invited into in this season. And it's a dark season. We are walking in darkness.
yeah.
And the hope of Advent is that Christ has brought a light to the world that can conquer the nations through love,
Yeah.
through the power of justice, through the power of showing up and being the hands and feet of God in our world. And so, what I'm encouraging my community this Sunday to do and all throughout Advent is put yourself in the Christmas story, put yourself in the longing. O come, Emmanuel, ransom us, captive Israel. Like, feel it, live it, be
Yes.
it, because it will prepare us for what's coming in January, which is lots of darkness, but we have a light that cannot be extinguished by hate, by bad policies, by immorality. And if we can have that same hope that has encouraged so many people for thousands of years in this moment, I think we can come out the other side of next year, the next 4 years,
Yeah.
really transforming ourselves, our communities, and our country.
It's beautiful, Brandon. I love it so much because like there's sense that we do the longing anyway, we do the waiting anyway, but then to have a space that's consecrated for that, where it gets to mean something, that
Yeah.
the waiting's not wasted, the longing's not wasted. There's actually there are these songs that Christians have been singing for all this time that are big enough to contain all that grief and despair and the depth of the longing. It's like there's room for all of it.
Yeah.
That's really wonderful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Well, Brandon, I am so grateful for your witness, grateful for your friendship. Thank you for doing what you do. And thank you just for being who you are, because I'm serious. It really, in terms of light in the darkness, I think of you so often as one of those folks that makes me want to keep going. Just your courage and your humility. What a gift to be able to spend this time with you today, my friend. I'm so grateful for it.
Well, thank you so much for cultivating these spaces and for the way you show up in the world. And I'm so grateful for this conversation.
Absolutely. We'll do it again soon, friend.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.